All right, so um, tonight we're going to cover chapter 6. Next week we'll cover chapter 7 and possibly chapter 8, depending on our time frame. Um, but I just wanted to kind of update us on our calendar. So this week we'll cover chapters 6 and chapter 7 next week. Between these next 3 weeks, the 21st and the 28th, sorry, the 14th, 21st, and 28th, between these next 3 weeks, we're going to get through chapters 8, 9, and 10. Okay. Then the week of November the 4th, I will be at a conference in the Panhandle. And so that will be an independent study day. And chapter 11 deals with ethics, which aligns with our QEP, our quality enhancement plan of ethical decision making. And so you will have your QEP assignment, basically looking at a case study, and then how would you respond to that using the QEP format of making the going to the 4 steps of making ethical decisions. So that will be your online assignment for your chapter 11. When we come back, remember, we will week 11 and week 18, November 11th and November 18th. On the November 11th, I will give you time to work on a presentation that you all will be giving on the 18th. Okay, so we will be having kind of a group presentation. I know we did one at the very beginning of the semester. We'll do another one. I will have that information to you by the 28th of October. So that way you can work on it during that week that we are out as well. Okay. My goal is to have it to you by the 21st. Full disclosure, I don't know what your presentation is going to be about yet. Okay. I still want to figure out what that is to make sure that I'm tying in the concepts of the entire semester so we can make like one kind of big presentation that pulls in all of the information. And so I will definitely have that to you. So that will give you time to start preparing for that. The week of November 11th, all during class, the entire class time will be time for you to work on and finalizing your presentation so that we can give that presentation on the 18th. Okay. And then remember, we will not have class on the 25th because that is Thanksgiving week. And then December 2nd, we will take our practice final exam. Okay. I do not have a midterm exam for any of my classes. I know some of your professors might have a midterm exam halfway through. I do not have a midterm exam. Okay. And so as a result, I do have kind of a checkpoint quiz for you to do. I will make sure that I have all of your grades graded by the end of this week. Anything that is missing, I will put a 0 in the grade book. Okay. And then part of that midterm check-in quiz gives you an opportunity to check in to say, bless you, to say, okay, this is my grade. This is what I think my grade should be, or what I want my grade to be. And then this is what I need to do for the second half of the semester to make sure I earn the grade that I want in this class. Okay. I will put in your midterm grades by the 20th of October is when your midterm grades are due. Okay. Any questions about the second half of our semester? It's hard to believe it's already halfway over. Um, any questions, comments, concerns?
Great.
All right. Okay. So let's talk about chapter 6. Communication. When you hear the word communication, if someone says, "What is communication?" How would you respond to that? Yes.
Communication is, verbal, nonverbal. It's, yeah, basically verbal, nonverbal. And the message being received or the message received being sent out is being received by the receiver
Okay.
and then being what do you call it? Not pushed back, but kind of sent towards that other person.
Okay, awesome. So types of communication, nonverbal and verbal. We'll talk about each of those in just a moment. Okay. It is a message that's being sent. Okay. It's a message between one or more people that is being sent. Anybody else have anything else to add to that? Sharing of information. Good. Anything else? Okay.
Like people think it's not, it's just like a simple, that's just the same. But I feel like communication is key, is very complex in a lot of type of situations, not just in the industry, but like especially like let's say the general manager is not at the chef, and then people don't want to talk about what the chef said this and then it leads to there. But like if they don't communicate with each other, then the whole operation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the success of an operation is dependent on communication and effective communication. Okay, good. Anybody else? No? Okay. So let's talk about some myths, some common myths about communication. Bless you. Okay. So take a look at these, review these 5 common myths about communication. Pick one that maybe you resonate with or one that kind of stands out to you. Think about maybe if there's there's a specific example that would debunk the myth or validate the myth. All right. Does someone have an example they'd like to share? Pick one of them and an example you'd like to share. Yes.
Small things in your phrasing or how you say words or choose. You don't think about it, but it gives a message you might not be.
Absolutely. Good. Okay. So we don't always communicate only when we want to communicate. Sometimes things that we're doing inadvertently will communicate a message. All right. What else? Go ahead, David. Okay. So what do you mean by that? Well, how is that a myth? Can you give me an example of why that's not true? Okay, absolutely. Okay. We just have a message. You have to send it. Then once you send that message, I have to decode it. I have to figure out what the meaning, I have to interpret that message, and then I have to think about how I'm going to respond to that message. Okay. And so sometimes communication feels like it's a one-way street if the other person is not responding, but in reality, it is definitely a two-way street. It goes back and forth. Okay, what else? Yep.
When there's no such thing as too much information, sometimes there is.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Well, like if I'm talking to you about a project and then I start talking to you about, well, my dog died and blah 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 and all this kind of stuff, you're probably thinking that's just too much information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Only talk about the project.
Absolutely. So when we're communicating, we want to think about when we're talking about what message you want to convey, we want to make sure that the details that we're talking about are specific to the conversation that's happening or the topic that we want to discuss, right? And so a lot of times students know, especially if they've had me in class before, they know it's really easy to get me off topic and onto something else over here. And then all of a sudden we got to bring it back to what we're focusing on. And I've actually had some students say in their end of course surveys that I do tangents too much. and it's too distracting to them. So I have to remember, I have to kind of reel that in sometimes, and try to focus on only the things that are needing to be discussed. Otherwise, it confuses people, right? If you throw in too many details, it's like, wait, hold on a second, what are we talking about? And then you can't focus on the main point of the topic of what we're trying to communicate. Anything else? Yep, Lex. Okay, can you give me an example of why that's not true? Text messaging, yeah. Okay, okay, yeah. And I think that also kind of goes up with that second one. Maybe not necessarily words, but maybe the emojis in that case mean the same thing to both the speaker and the listener, both the sender and the receiver. You're like, why did I get that message? I don't understand that. I can't interpret that. And so, a couple of things that we're going to talk about are some barriers to effective communication. So, some things that prevent us from communicating effectively. Okay. So, again, take a look at this list up here. And anybody have a comment, question, or concern, a question about how any one of these would be a barrier to effective communication? Yeah, Jason.
So security with managers where I recognize a workflow that we can easily fix, but they're too entitled with what they believe that they just want and fail. And they look at me like, why I failed.
Yeah. So sometimes if you think that you are, we talked about in chapter 5, we talked about power and positional power, and so you think, oh well, I'm in this position, so this person that's down here can't possibly have any input onto how we can improve this because, well, they're down there in this position, I'm up here in this position. That arrogance or that superiority can prevent that person from actually listening and effectively understanding what that person's insight could be. And then, like you said, maybe potentially it'll fail. Okay. And what that leads to oftentimes is this person down here either isn't heard, and so then what they may have some really great ideas, they may be like a rock star person, rock star employee, but if these people have that arrogance and that superiority complex, they're not listening to them, this person stops offering ideas. And it's like, okay, fine, you're not going to listen to me, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing, I'm just going to sit here and do the bare minimum, right? And that person doesn't find enjoyment and they find a job somewhere else. Like we talked about one other last class, I believe we talked about how people don't quit jobs, they quit people more often. Okay. And so if they're going to try to find a location or an environment where they feel like they can contribute to the success of the team. And if someone has that arrogance or that superiority, they may not be open to listening to that. Okay. What else? Okay. Talk to me about environment. Okay. Absolutely. Oh, excuse me one second. You're welcome. All right, so we talked about arrogance, superiority, and environment. What else? Defensiveness. Okay, so how does that affect your communication?
They get defensive because, like, I guess I'm younger, and I told them, like, hey, like, how come you guys just sign up the paper and don't check the phones? And then little too dark. But cilantro, the tomatoes already have mold in it. Some of our breads also. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, that's the problem. You're the problem. And then they get all defensive about it. Well, I think for 30 years it's worked, but I'm like, in those 30 years, y'all had a chef, the same chef for 20, and different chefs come and go, come and go. And I think some of the reason is y'all get too defensive and thinking, hey, I think for years I know what I'm doing, but in fact, yeah, you know what you're doing when you're cooking, but I think culinary itself is more broader than just cooking. And I think they've been so stuck on the line that even though their position is supervisor or team lead, they've been so stuck on the line that they don't know that, hey, you gotta be the leader, not just the line. You also gotta, there's different aspects like the walking, like putting away all that, like, taking initiative when the chef's not there and lead, and I feel like they get defensive when I try to do that because nobody's doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes too, people get defensive in that because, and I've had this conversation with a couple of students as they do their internships, right? Because people have typically, when students are doing their internships, they're new to that position. And like you said, there's people that have been doing that position for many years, sometimes even a couple of decades. And then here comes this person that's like, hey, why are you doing it this way? And that also is an opportunity to learn how we communicate. And so sometimes our actions can communicate. We can lead by our example of doing things, and then we can show, okay, you did it this way, it didn't quite work out. I did it this way, it did work out. This is the end result. So let's go for this end result that is actually successful. And so sometimes I remember one time when I was working as an intern at an event place, and the linen has a right side up and a wrong side up, right? The linen has the seam that's on the underside of it. And so if you're looking at the right side, it's nice and flat on the edge. But then if you look at the underside, it kind of has that seam where you can kind of feel the edge. And one of the very first events that I worked, the person who had set up the buffet line, she put one of the linens inside out. Like she put the wrong side facing up. Not only that, but it had the tag that showed. And so I just casually, wasn't being critical, but I just casually, she was talking to one of the owners, and I just casually walked over and said, hey, is this linen inside out? Shouldn't it be flipped over? It took her like almost 4 months to get over the fact that I called her out in front of the owner about that linen. So we had to take everything off the table, flip the linen over. It took her like 4 months. It was like, okay, here's this new guy who's never been here before, and now he's going to come in and start poking it and looking at all my flaws. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm here to do. I was asking a legitimate question because this is my first event ever. And I think this should be turned around, but maybe it's there set for a reason that way. I don't know. I'm just trying to learn. So sometimes how we approach those situations, especially with people who have been in a position for a long time, is different than how we're going to present that or approach that position, that commentary to somebody else that maybe is a little bit newer to the position. Because then we can kind of help eliminate that defensiveness. Okay. What else? Yes, Vanessa. Sorry, go ahead, Vanessa. Oh, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's good. I'll give you another example of a difference in background. So coming up in a couple of weeks, we have our salsa competition. Okay. And last year when we did the salsa competition with the high school students, the culinary class, the international cuisine class, puts out the little boats of tortilla chips, right? And so their assignment was to put out the boats of tortilla chips. Well, towards the end, what's left in the bottom of the bag? Just like those broken pieces of chips, right? And so there was one boat that had just all these broken pieces of chips. Did they do their job? Sure. They put chips in a boat. Yes. The difference in the background, back of the house, I'm front of the house. I'm all about the appearance. So I just asked the students, I said, if you had the choice between this boat that has perfectly wonderful chips in it and this boat that has crumbs in it. I didn't post it that way. I just said, if you had the choice between this one and this one, which one would you choose? Which one do you think they chose? The beautiful chips, right? And I said, okay, so then why is this on the table? Because if you wouldn't eat it, then you shouldn't put it out. Okay? There's a difference in the background. The culinary person's like, I got to use all these chips because I paid for these chips. I got to get this all out there. The front of the house person is like, you know what? I don't really necessarily, doesn't look as appealing, so I'm not going to put that out there. And so that difference in backgrounds, also experience, also plays a role in that as well. They've never been to a situation where they put something out like that. And so maybe, hopefully, by learning that lesson, hopefully I communicated effectively that they will then prevent that from happening in the future. All right. So let's go back to our different types of communication: upward, downward, and lateral. Okay. Let's start with lateral. What does lateral communication mean? Employee to employee in the same level, right? So let's use a restaurant as our example. So if we have servers, who else is on the same level as a server in the front of the house? Okay, so other servers, good. Who else? A server is like a frontline position. A host or hostess, and who else? The bussers, right? So lateral communication, that server telling that host, hey, you know what? I'm so sorry. I just got double sat and I'm really behind. Can you skip me in the next rotation? That's a lateral communication to the same level position. Or the server to the busser, my tables are empty. Can you help me out by bussing the tables so I can get more tables, more guests? Or same thing with the busser and the host or hostess. You know, the bussers, hey, I'm really far behind. Can you give me a hand? Can you come over and can you collect all of the glassware? Or here's the towel. I'll clear all the dishes. Can you wipe the tables off? That lateral communication is something within the same level of the position. Okay. What is upward communication? Communicating to your supervisor or your boss. Okay. Going up. So maybe there's a concern. Maybe you have a recommendation of how we can make things a little bit better. Whatever, we're going to communicate up. We talked about it last class, I believe, when we talked about the chain of command. We don't want to skip that chain of command. We want to go up the channels as necessary. And then what's downward communication? Yeah, so boss to the employee. What are some examples of something that might be communicated downward to the associates? There's any kind of policy changes. Good. So probably the policy change is going to happen up at the top levels, and then they're going to tell the managers, maybe department chairs, department managers, and then they're going to tell the supervisors, and then the supervisors are going to tell the frontline staff. Okay, that communication is going downward. So the best way to think about the organizational communication is to do it from, think about the organizational chart. Okay. Sorry, my headphone just died. So let me just make sure that my microphone is close to my mouth. All right. Different types of interpersonal space. Interpersonal, in between people. Okay, interpersonal. We have the public space. So you all are in the public space. Okay, you are out in that area compared to where I am. Okay. Then we have our social space. That's where a lot of our communication happens, is within that social space. So we may be kind of in a circle talking to each other, or we may be nearby, but not necessarily really close. Personal space. What is personal space? That's my bubble, right? How many of you have ever heard that? Okay, stay out of my bubble. And so that personal space, sometimes we do get into personal spaces. We should try to avoid that. That can be a barrier to communication, because if you are too close to somebody, they're focused more on your proximity to them than they are the words that are coming out of your mouth and the message you're trying to convey. And so sometimes when you're really close to somebody, and you're in that personal space, it is can be a barrier to effective communication. And then, of course, the intimate space is right against people. So sometimes when I say hello, I give people a hug. Okay, that's technically in that intimate space. Um, some people aren't comfortable with that. And so there's always kind of awkward when I'm saying hello to a group of people that I know, and there's usually one person that I don't know. I've given everybody a hug, and then I get to that one person, I'm like, I don't know what to do, right? Do I give you a hug? Do I do the awkward, like, here's my hand to shake, right? So when you're shaking your hands, that's that kind of in that personal, you're kind of intruding into somebody's personal space. And so it's really important that we understand where we are in relation to everybody else around us to make sure that our communication is being effective. As we are looking at different communication, as far as verbal communication, we want to think about how loud our volume is. Okay. Um, if I'm up here and I'm speaking really softly, it may be hard for somebody in the back to hear because I'm not projecting my voice. If I'm speaking very softly, what does that communicate to you as an audience? It might be a little shy. Okay, what else? Okay, I might be calmer. What else? I might be nervous. I may lack the confidence. I may not even know what I'm talking about. Okay. And so if I don't have that confidence in the topic that I'm presenting, then that can be translated into the tone I'm using. Okay. Do you have a comment, Lex? Yeah. The inarticulation, unable to articulate your thoughts and be able to articulate what you want to communicate is really definitely a barrier to that effective communication. The other thing you want to think about is your tempo. How many times have you been in a class or you've been in a situation where the person is talking so fast? And it's hard to even understand what they're saying because you can't focus on what they're saying because you're trying to think about what they're saying here, but they've already moved on to this sentence over here. So it's hard to process that. So understanding what your tempo is, but at the same time, you don't want to speak too slowly because then that takes way too much time and it's hard to focus. I remember the first time I ever fell asleep in a class in high school, my pre-cal teacher had such a monotonous tone and he spoke so slowly. It was almost like Eeyore. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is perfect for me to go to sleep too. And I just had lunch, so I'm really full. I failed that class. But I laugh now, but that was very traumatic when I was a junior in high school. But that the volume, the tone, the rate, the inflections that you use, all of that is important to communicate effectively. Different parts of any kind of a formal presentation, of course, we want to have an introduction, just like you would have in a paper. This is the information we're going to talk about. And then here's how we present the information, and then wrap it up, and here's what we talked about. Okay. I'll tell you one of the pieces of advice one of my professors told me in when I was working on my bachelor's degree. He said, slides are free. Okay. Slides are free. What does that mean? What's that? To do a presentation, yep, slides are free. What does that mean? Use slides. I don't have to cram every single thing onto one slide. I can spread that out onto multiple slides. So if the information is too crowded, goes back to that comment we made earlier about too much information. There is such thing as too much information. If you put too much information on a slide, then people are trying to figure out where the information is, and then you've already kind of talked about the first point, but you're moving on to the second, and they're still focused trying to figure out where that is. So slides are free. Take that information and break it apart. I had during the pandemic, I did a leadership training that the college district was offering, a leadership development training, and we had to come up with a project as a class, as a group, as a cohort, and we had to present that project to the college leadership. And they asked me to create the slide presentation. Okay, we had 5 minutes to give this presentation. That was it. 5 minutes is not a long time. Okay, my presentation was 12 slides. 12 slides, right? So we log in an hour early so we can practice, and I share the slides, and one of the people in the group was like, "David, your presentation is 12 slides." I said, "Yes, it is 12 slides." I'm like, "There's no way we're going to get through 12 slides in 5 minutes." And because they freaked out, everybody else started freaking out. And then all of a sudden they were like, "We got to redo the slide presentation. We only have an hour to practice. We got to redo the slide presentation, and we have to practice in that same time." And I just sat back and I got real quiet. And they're like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "Well, do you want to see my presentation? Because you've only seen the first slide. All you've seen is the number 12 on the bottom, and you've seen my first slide. That's all you've seen. Can I give you my presentation? Can I show it to you? Or do you guys want to freak out and redo the entire presentation?" So I gave them presentation in 3.5 minutes. But what they would have put onto one slide, I broke out into 4 slides. So I didn't spend 2 minutes on one slide. I spent about 10 to 15 seconds on 4 slides. And by doing that, it allowed me to focus on that one particular topic, and then I moved on. And then I move on to the next topic. Whereas if I have it all on the same slide, that's when you have the tendency to get up here and start rambling, because you have all this information you got to cover. Well, I've covered that information. Let's move on to the next slide. 15 seconds. This is what we're going to present. And they all kind of calmed down. I almost was like, you know what? Fine, go ahead and do it. I was gonna think about what Jason said earlier. Okay, you have a way to do it? Fine, do it. Don't ask me to do it in the future. Why did I spend my time? Why did I waste my time doing this when you probably should have just done it yourself to begin with? And maybe you ever feel like that before with your boss? It's like, why'd you tell me to do it if you're just gonna change it and do it your way? Okay, that's really, really unfortunate. We want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So think about that when I eventually give you your homework, your group project assignment for a presentation, that slides are free. Feedback. Feedback is part of communication. Okay. What does it mean by feedback needs to be well timed? Jason.
Positive of the negative part of one fix, but the other positive way to receive it.
Absolutely. So that's one way to format our feedback so we can focus on something positive, focus on what we need to change. Okay. Because if we start off with the negative, they're going to get what? They're going to get defensive. So it's like, hey, you know what? You did this really awesome. Hey, you checked in this produce so quickly. You're like record time. That's awesome. Now our parsley's a little dark and there's some mold on these tomatoes. So what can we do to prevent that from happening? But hey, the carrots look great. Okay. So that's our sandwich method. This is great, something you're doing good. So what we need to work on, and then finish off with more of a positive. Okay. What about timing of feedback? How is timing of the feedback important? What do you think, Nabil? What time is it appropriate to give feedback, or what time is it not appropriate to give feedback? Okay, can you give me an example? Yeah, absolutely. And so if that you might read the situation, okay, if that person is upset, they're really emotional, maybe not right now is not the time to give them that feedback. We can give it to them at a later time. How much time is too much time to go by? Okay. Someone can't do something wrong today and then you don't correct it. And then 2 weeks later, they do the same thing and be like, hey, remember 2 weeks ago when you made this mistake? Yeah, that's not well timed. Okay. We got to give that feedback relatively immediately. But if immediate is not appropriate, they make a mistake, they're in front of guests. We're not going to berate them. We're not going to belittle them in front of customers or guests. We're going to wait till they are off, maybe at their closing of their shift. Okay, I noticed that this, and this happened. Let's figure out what we can do to avoid that from happening again in the future. Okay, so we definitely don't want to. We want to make sure that we are in that space, that both the sender and the receiver are open to that communication. Is that what you're going to say? Okay, yeah, absolutely. We also want to make sure that the feedback is specific. Has anybody ever walked away from a situation where like, I don't know what my boss wants me to do? Okay. And you're just like, okay, great. I had this conversation, but I don't really know what I need to do. It wasn't specific. And so in that case, you risk the chance of making that mistake again. Okay. Um, and then one thing I do want to make a comment about is that it's unemotional. Okay, unemotional. We're going to talk about emotions right here when we talk about writing in just a second. Different types of listening that um, we want to discuss as part of communication. Right, it's a two-way street. Sometimes you are listening to make a decision. Okay, to evaluate a situation and actually take that information and decide about something, make a decision. You might look at a situation and evaluate what is any potential safety concerns. Okay, so a chef instructor that is in a class that has 20 people that are holding the chef knives for the first time ever, and they're all learning their knife skills, they are going to be looking for and evaluating the situation, and then you need to listen to how the chef is presenting that information. Sometimes you're gathering just information, you're just getting that basic information, and you're going to store that for a later time. Okay. And then the empathetic listening oftentimes is what we are doing when we are working with our guests. Okay. And or as a leader, as a leader of an organization, you are listening that empathetically sometimes to your associates and your team members. Okay. So we want to make sure that we are practicing those different types of listening. All right, with writing, this is the last section before we move on. With writing, we want to be specific. We want to know what's our reason for writing something. We want to be as concise as possible. Okay. Um, and we also want to know what is the best way to present that information. Is it in a text message? That is writing. Okay. Is it in an email? Is it in a letter? Okay. What is the best way to present that information and what information is essential for that person to know? Because again, there is such thing as too much information. Okay. There are some opportunities for having too much information in writing because then at that point, the message definitely gets lost. Okay. We want to try to avoid jargon. What is jargon? Not necessarily fluff. No, jargon has a specific definition. Exactly. Exactly. So jargon is things that you would say to people that are like that know the same terminology, right? So a server, they could ask, if somebody asks, if they want to make, if they're ordering a burger, A server wouldn't say something like, would you want to make any mods to that? Well, another server would know that's modifications. Okay. But somebody else wouldn't necessarily know that. They're like, huh, what? I don't understand what you're asking me. So trying to avoid jargon will prevent that misinterpretation. Okay. Um, and then also, again, we want to use that specific language. In emails, how many of you feel like you're excellent at writing emails? Decent. Okay, that's good. Awesome. How many of you hate writing emails? Why do you hate writing emails? Andre?
I feel like
Yeah, okay. Excellent. Talking, calling, those are great. However, sometimes we do need to have emails. We need to have a documentation of this is what we talked about. So let me give you an example. I had a client one time when I was planning events, and for whatever reason, we had sausage and we had chicken, or so we had sausage and brisket as the menu, the two proteins. But sausage and brisket are both like red meat and or pork, right? It was a beef sausage, so it was both red meats. And the client changed to having chicken and brisket so that there was a white meat option and a red meat option. Okay. So then the event shows up and the catering staff sets up the buffet line and they bring out the chicken and the meeting planner goes through and she sees chicken and brisket and she flips out. She was like, no, we had talked about having sausage, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, great. Let me pull out my email where on January 17th, you said you wanted to have chicken and brisket. So you had a white meat option and a red meat option. If I didn't have that email communication and it was just a verbal over the phone, I have no documentation of that happening. So sometimes, especially as we move into business, now personally, yes. In my personal life, do I send a lot of emails? Not usually. I will text over sending an email, mostly because people don't check their emails, their personal emails, oftentimes. So I will text because that usually gives a faster response. But in business, we definitely want to have that email trail. And that goes back to that last point there of maintaining the thread. So we want to reply so that way it all stays in the same thread, just like you'd have like a group text message. Okay, what else? Why don't y'all like writing emails? Yep. Okay. Yeah. Nobody reads it. Nobody sends. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So sometimes it's helpful to call and then follow up with an email. So that way you have that documentation. Thank you so much for your time on the phone. This is an outline of what we talked about. And so then that way there is that documentation of having that. I saw another hand over somewhere. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I have 6 different email addresses that are connected to my phone. So on average, average day, I'm probably going to get anywhere between 150 to 250 emails. Most of them from my personal are going to be junk emails, right? Subscriptions that I signed up for, or I put my email address in here, and now all of a sudden I'm getting, I enter the Better Homes and Garden, win a free home, and then now all of a sudden I'm getting emails for life from these companies that I know nothing about. That's how they get their money. They sell your email list. Yeah, so a lot of that is frustrating, but work for professional use. Email typically is still the communication of choice, the written communication of choice. And then not only on top of that, we utilize here at Elmo Colleges, we utilize Teams, which Teams is very similar to text messaging, right? So if I have a question to somebody, I can send them a message through Teams, but it's more connected to Microsoft, and it has everybody that's an employee of the Alamo Colleges, so I don't have to have their cell phone number to send them a text message. I can reach out to them that way. We want to, when we are sending emails, though, we want to make sure that we're putting a pretty not a very long, but a pretty descriptive subject line, so that the person knows, is this something I can read now or can I read it later? Okay, is it time sensitive or is it not? And then we also want to make sure that as we're writing that email, we want to try to avoid all capital letters, which signifies yelling. Okay. We want to keep those emojis maybe to a minimum, unless of course you know that person. Okay. But if you're emailing somebody for the first time ever, that is your opportunity to establish that level of professionalism with that individual. Okay. Any questions, comments, concerns? Oh, let's talk about real quick about the CC. What does CC mean on an email? Carbon copy or courtesy copy, one of those two. Okay. So what does that mean if I courtesy copy somebody? Why would I courtesy copy somebody? To get the information. So maybe the email itself is not addressed to them, but I want them to be aware of the information. Okay, I want to loop them in. So a lot of times what we'll do is I'll send an email to somebody and I'll loop in my supervisor or I'll loop in my boss. So that way they're aware of that. Okay. What about BCC? Blind carbon copy. Okay. So blind carbon copy, is anybody not familiar with blind carbon copy, BCC? Okay, so BCC is typically used. I'll give you an example of how I use it professionally. I go to a wedding show and I meet 60 different brides, and they all want my same price information. I don't want to send 60 different emails. I want to send one email. So I send my email to myself. I put my email address in the to field. So it sends the email back to me. And then in BCC, I put all of those brides' emails. Okay. And the reason why it does that is because I'm protecting the privacy of all those email addresses. And so when I hit send, when the message comes through, it's going to go to all those 60 people, but it's only going to show my email address. That's it. Okay. Now, if I CC'd them, they would all see everybody else's email address. Okay. That's kind of a lack of that breaks that privacy. Okay. The other benefit of that is when somebody replies to me, it only goes to the person whose email is visible, right? If I put them in the CC, the courtesy copy, and somebody hits reply all, it's going to go to everybody, that response. So if I hit reply, it's going to go just to the person who sent it. But reply all goes to everybody whose email is visible. Now, that's how I use it professionally. Maybe a little bit more on the nefarious side. I have an argument with a coworker, right? Or if I have a beef with somebody and I want my boss to know about it, I may BCC my boss. So that way, if that person comes back and starts complaining that I didn't ever share this information with them, my boss is aware of the situation. We want to use that very sparingly. Okay. We don't want to get that reputation of, oh my gosh, this person is always BCCing somebody, because eventually they're going to start BCCing stuff about you as well. Okay. So we don't want to try to get into that kind of a situation. But there are times where, you know what? Okay, I want this person to be aware that I am sending this information to this other person, but I don't want that person to know that this other person is aware of it. Um, and so, because then also, too, sometimes people might take it as a personal attack. Right. So if you're bringing something to somebody's attention and you CC the boss on it and they see that you copied the boss on it, they may even get even more defensive. And so sometimes using that BCC allows us to prevent that defensiveness from coming out, or maybe even embarrassment. Um, and so they may be really embarrassed that they aren't really following the policies the way they should be. And you're calling them out in front of the boss. It's like us almost if you were in a meeting, right? And you called somebody out in the middle of a meeting, how they might react versus, okay, you've had the meeting and now you go talk to your boss over here on the side about the situation. Think about it in that perspective. So you could use it professionally. So a lot of times when I send information out to students, I will BCC because I don't want your email addresses to be accessible to everybody. So I'll BCC it. You'll notice you'll get an email that it's addressed from me and it's addressed to me because then you want to make sure you're putting your email address there because then you get a copy of that email. So then again, you have the record of that email being sent. Okay. Any questions about copying, courtesy copying, BCC? All right. How many of you are going to go home and BCC somebody? Now you know what it's for. All right. So we're going to do an activity. Let's take about, what time is it? 7:45. Let's take 5 minutes, and we'll meet upstairs on the fourth floor. Okay, and so you guys can bring all your stuff with you because we'll leave from that area upstairs.